Hello and happy spring, happy equinox. Today I'm going to be talking about making wild fermented soda, and I'm going to be highlighting seasonal ingredients that I can get from my landscape here in western Pennsylvania in the US, and I'm going to demonstrate how to use those ingredients in making some delicious and very simple sodas. I think this is the perfect time of year to really connect to the earth. So many traditions have different rituals around this, and I think a great way is to embrace what the earth is offering to us because there is little fresh food at this point. It is March, it's early March where I am right now, and I'm going to be using some tree medicine as well as some wild edible fungi, and I'm going to make some delicious soda to celebrate this season. The method of fermentation that I'm using for this specific product is wild fermentation, so I'm utilizing the wild microbes that are on the ingredients that I'm using. Specifically, I'm using the wild microbes that are on the white pine needles and the eastern hemlock, and I'll talk about why I chose those. But this was all inspired by Sandor Katz, Pascal Baudard, people who are doing and demonstrating the simple aspect of making bubbly ferments this way and utilizing your local resources, your wild microbes that are from your landscape and from your local ingredients. And of course, wild fermentation is used for so many other ferments around the world, so this is a very simple aspect of fermentation that I'm sure many of you are aware of, and I hope that you get enough out of this to really adapt to whatever ingredients you're using, whatever season you're in, whatever you have available to you, hopefully coming from your local landscape, and to celebrate the spring and this special time of year. The soda I'm demonstrating today is a wild fermented white pine soda, and I'm using the white pine needles that I harvested just the other day. I'm using just a handful. I don't often weigh these or measure them. For the sake of this workshop, I did weigh some in the batches that I will strain later on, and I will mention what those measurements are. But for this sake, I'm just showing you how easy this is. I'm just using a handful of white pine. And I'm cutting it with scissors, and this is to get some of those aromatics and flavors out. Really just exposing as much flavor as possible. And we're relying on the wild microbes, bacteria, yeast coming from these pine needles. There we go. Because I'm focusing on the flavors of this time of year, flavors that represent my local landscape, I'm using maple syrup as my sweetener, and maple syrup is in season right now. The trees are being tapped, the sap is flowing, and our local farmers and sap makers are boiling down their sap to make this delicious, sweet flavored substance. So I'm using roughly a third cup. Let's see, in milliliters, I don't know, 75 milliliters, something like that. That's the general ratio I like to use per quart of water. So per quart of soda that I'm making, I like to start with less sugar. That way I can adjust the amount of sweetness. That way if I add too much sugar, I don't have to start diluting it by adding more water. So I start low, and then right before I bottle it, which I'll go over, that's when I adjust the sweetness. So to start, we have the pine needles, we have the maple syrup. You know, you could use any other sugar, really, it doesn't matter. Cane sugar, honey, that's all acceptable here. And then I'm just adding a quart or roughly a liter of water. filtered water is ideal. Stay away from heavily chlorinated water. Now, that's the basic first step. We have our raw ingredient, the pine needles. That's where the microbes are coming from. Now just stir it up to get it mixed. And from here on out, I'm going to stir it 2 to 3 times daily for 30 seconds to 60 seconds. And I'm aerating those microbes. I'm getting them active, preventing any mold growth on the surface. And this is a very important step because we want to make sure that those yeast and bacteria are thriving, and we want to make sure that we're creating the ideal environment for them to thrive and to prevent those unwanted microbes, those mold that can come and sit on top of the surface. So we're trying to avoid those and taking advantage of what we want to make this a delicious soda eventually. So there's day one. Now I usually put on a lid. I tend to notice that plastic lids are a little bit better because the metal doesn't deteriorate over time, but you can use a lid if you'd like to, as long as you're burping it daily. Instead of stirring it, you could just shake it. And then just make sure you're burping it afterwards to release any of that CO2. You could also just put a cloth or a rag over top. Make sure you're preventing any bugs and critters from getting in there. And then you could use a spoon like I just did to stir it. So here we are on day 5 of the Wild-Fermented sodas. And I checked on their activity. They're nice and fizzy. So here's the first one. This is white pine needles with maple syrup and just a quart of water. Not as many bubbles in there, but when I shook it up earlier, it was very active. This one is hemlock with maple syrup. Getting a little bit more fizz there. And this one is Meyer lemon with pine needles, maple syrup, and cane sugar. Now this one is more active than the other ones. You can kind of see and hear the activity. See that it's got a little fizz already? That's what we're looking for. Once you have that activity and you know that it's ready to be bottled to carbonate, that's when you taste it to assess the sweetness. So again, I used a 1/3 cup of sugar in this. And I taste good flavor. It tastes white piney. It tastes a little acidic from the lemon. It's lacking a little bit of sugar. And ideally, when you're bottling it, you want it to be slightly sweeter than you actually want it, because when you're carbonating, those yeast are consuming some of that sugar, and they're producing that CO2. So as they consume the sugar, that means you're going to be tasting less sugar. So you want to sweeten it to slightly more than the ideal point where you'd want to drink it. So because it's not as sweet as I would like it, I'm just going to start by adding, I think a tablespoon will be perfect for this. So I'm going to add a tablespoon and then pour it into the bottle. So I added that tablespoon of maple syrup to add a little extra sweetness for the carbonation and to create that perfect sweetness for when it's finished and carbonated. And now I'm going to strain it off into my bottle. Now if you wanted, you could keep some of those raw ingredients in there if you wanted to keep flavoring it in the bottle you're using. Now sometimes, because of the raw ingredients that are in the vessel that you're originally fermenting in, you have what is not a perfect liter or perfect quart. So this much headspace, it could be okay. You could carbonate in this. I like to fill it up all the way. And I just happen to have another batch of wild pine soda that's active and ready, so I'm going to just top it off with that. You could top it off with water and a little bit more sugar, but in that case you're also diluting the flavor, so it's up to you at this point. Just recognize that when you have this much headspace, you could have some acetic bacteria that are coming in there, or you could have some funkier flavors. Might not always be the case, but it's something to think about as you're carbonating. So I topped it off, it's here, and it's ready to be capped. Now, for those who are familiar with Sandor Katz and Pascal, they talk about using plastic bottles, the benefit of that being that you feel the pressure. Of course, most people want to reduce plastic use right now and prevent polluting the earth and relying on petroleum products. In this case, I save a lot of these plastic bottles and I reuse them pretty often. And because they are perfect for that carbonation technique, and I can feel the pressure and understand when it's carbonated, that's why I use these. I will also often use these flip-top bottles. You want to make sure that they are food grade and that they are made to actually hold pressure. Some of the ones you buy online might not actually be made for that. They might be more ornamental. But what you could do if you're making maybe a half-gallon batch, you could fill up one with a plastic bottle, fill the rest in here, and use your plastic bottle to gauge the pressure. And when this is ready, then this one will be ready. And ready could be relative. Some people might want it to be super carbonated, but really you're just going after that resistance when you press in. Once you know that it's at the right carbonation for you, put it in your fridge and let it sit in there for a couple hours at least to a day. And then when you open it, make sure you're opening it over your sink, over a bowl, just in case it's more carbonated than you realize, just in case you have a spillover and you don't cause a mess. So if you're interested in the amount or the weight of the ingredients that I used for this one, I used roughly 19 grams of pine, 1 small lemon, and 3 tablespoons of maple, roughly 57 grams of maple syrup. Plus I added another tablespoon, so you can figure that into there, and then roughly a quart or a liter of water. Some of my favorite flavors to add during this time of the year, during the equinox, is some roots. So I have burdock root here, and I'm just eyeballing this. And I'm going to make a decoction tea out of this. I have turkey tail mushrooms that were recently foraged. I'm going to place just a small handful in there. Crush them up a little bit. These are pretty fresh, so they're not that dry, but dry enough to crumble a little bit. And in addition to the medicinal qualities of these plants and fungi, I'm also getting some earthy flavors, some bitter flavors, some subtle sweet flavors, and I have dandelion root here that I'm going to add as well. Again, I just eyeball it. I don't have a specific recipe I'm going after. And I'm just going to simmer this for 15 to 20 minutes or until it reaches my desired flavor. Alright, so here I have my burdock, dandelion root, turkey tail tea, and I'm pouring it over. Gonna measure it out. I tasted it. It was simmering for about 20 minutes and tasted bitter and earthy and medicinal, if you will. And I'm going to take my hemlock wild-fermented concoction here and use it as the starter. So I have about half a liter of the tea, and I'm gonna fill the rest with this hemlock starter. And from here I want to taste it and assess the sweetness. Since the tea didn't have any sweetness in it, I'll definitely need some more sweetener, probably to make it taste better. Yeah, it tastes like a weak, lightly sweetened tea. So I'm going to add some more. I'm going to probably do 2 tablespoons of sugar and then taste it from there. So I added a little over 2 tablespoons of sugar and it tastes good. I actually added a tablespoon of lemon juice as well to round out the flavor, give a little bit of acidity. And now I'm just gonna pour it right into my bottle. And now we have our earthy, slightly bitter hemlock, turkey tail, dandelion root, and burdock root soda that will be carbonating in this bottle. So just to wrap up, once you have your wild ferments in the bottles, you want to wait until you can feel that carbonation. It could take from a few hours to a few days, depending on the weather, depending on the season, and how active those microbes are. So just make sure you're watching those bottles. And lastly, I encourage everyone to look up the standards if you're going to be foraging any ingredients, and recognize whose land you are foraging on, and make sure that you're harvesting a small amount of the population that you're taking from. And just do it wisely, make sure you're doing all the right research, and make sure you're actually foraging for the right plants and you're not potentially going to harm yourself or anyone else. So thank you very much for partaking in this little wild fermented soda course. And I hope you enjoy. I hope you have a wonderful spring, wonderful equinox, and that you can celebrate with some bubbly wild fermented soda.